Welcome back to Beyond the Woo, Demystifying Psychedelics. So Jennie Marie, tell me more about kind of what you've been thinking since we last sat down to talk about like faith and psychedelics. Like what's been percolating for you?
Yeah, I think what percolates for me is why do we resist this as a
Mhm.
medical treatment?
Mhm.
The Bible references often, when you're sick, go to a medical doctor. You know, these plants that I've given you, their leaves are promoted for healing. So why is it that we accept an antibiotic as a medicine?
Excellent point.
Mm.
Yeah, is it I mean that's a really good question. It strikes me as like is it because that is it just habit? We're used to the authority of doctors?
Hmm.
I mean, that's a hard question. Like, what happens that I mean, well, we're seeing it in other places too. I mean, there are people who have real questions about the safety of medicine, the safety of vaccines right now too. So what is it about psychedelics that kind of sets people on edge about the authority of is it the authority of the medicine, the authority of the therapist, the authority of the self? Is it like where do we go with that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting intersection
Mhm.
of faith and science, cultural evolution, and I think there's a lot of tension in that area. And what creates medical authority? What
Mm.
creates authority? What becomes the line that we actually can say? So, how much research needs to be done? Because if it's research based, wow, I got to tell you, going back into early 60s work, even back to the 40s, there
Mhm.
is a lot of research.
There's a ton of research, and there's a ton of research now. There's a ton of research happening right now in medicine, in psychopharmacology that's looking at what are the benefits of psychedelics versus the benefit of, say, SSRIs and SSNIs. Like the research is there. The medicine is very, very prevalent. It's showing us more and more. I mean, one of the most important studies that's come out in the last few years for me as a therapist is looking at people who have taken SSRIs and are, in a controlled environment and looking at this, another cohort of people who've been given psychedelics, and the people with the greater healing are the people taking the psychedelics. And it's really astonishing because what they found, and this is, these are not like woo woo therapists. These are, like me. These are people who are like medical doctors and psychopharmacologists and neuroscientists looking at the effects over time and seeing that if you give someone a psychedelic for 30 days, or not 30 days straight, but for you look at them for 30 days after giving them a psychedelic experience, and you look at people who are taking an SSRI for 30 days, the outcomes on the psychedelic are better. People wind up expanding their capacity for feeling. Whereas, if you're talking about an SSRI, what happens is the capacity is narrowed. So they don't have high highs, they don't have low lows, they just kind of stay in this middle ground. Whereas with someone who's taking psychedelics, they actually expand their capacity for feeling. Really, it's really astonishing.
Really astonishing. And I think the other astonishing fact that we don't look at is look, a doctor says, hey, take this SSRI,
Hmm.
check back with me in 2 weeks. Let's see how you're doing. So now if someone is chronically suicidal and it's now elevated to active suicidality,
Mm.
we're going to give you a medicine. We're going to check in 2 weeks to see if this starts to reduce it. And you know what we know? In 2 weeks, there's not much
Yeah,
impact. It's
yeah,
not until 4 or 6 weeks in,
right.
where we have seen multiple research articles that now are proving that with a single dose of a psychedelic, that many people are reporting a 90% reduction in suicide ideation
Hmm.
and active suicide planning.
Hmm. It's interesting because it's immediate, right? It's not, and to be fair, it's not just go take some shrooms, right? This is with a practitioner. This is doing it in a safe way, but it is almost a day and night change, right? Like you have a psychedelic experience, your suicidality is curbed. You take some SSRIs for 2 weeks, and maybe you feel a little less suicidal, but it's not. It doesn't usually touch the underlying cause, which is the capacity.
Absolutely. Not to mention, there's a lot of side effects with these
Oh, yeah.
psychotropic meds, sexual side effects,
Mhm.
weight gain.
Mhm.
Even there's some research that is correlating possibilities of dementia later in life or Alzheimer's. So there's some pretty
Yeah.
significant side effects, as well as you can develop serotonin syndrome
Syndrome.
if you
Yeah.
combine the wrong type of SSRIs.
Right.
So there is a lot of side effects. We're not really seeing side effects with these medicines.
Not like that. Not like that. I mean, there are risks, right? Like there's a risk with anything. People who, have bipolar disorder should talk to their practitioner before they or talk to their psychiatrist before they do a psychedelic of any kind or an SSRI of any kind because it does carry the risk of serotonin syndrome. These are medicines. They are affecting brain chemistry. So I don't want to I want to be careful to just, kind of plug the neuroscience a little bit and say, don't, if you're bipolar, you should talk to your doctor before you take any kind of psychotropic med, whether it's an SSRI or take a hero's dose of psychedelics. But yeah, the evidence is out there. And there's even, to be fair, there's also research out there of people who are, historically have taken psychotropic drugs for, on a prescription who have been willing to risk the effects and report back that they had better outcomes than people who didn't. So again, we're back to discernment, right? Like be sure to be careful how you're talking about taking psychedelics and doing it in a responsible way with guidance with your therapist, with a doctor. I mean, but also another, thing that comes up for me is people are scared to talk to their doctors about wanting to do psychedelics. And I think that one of the things, and it goes back to what we're talking about with faith, like where do you put your faith and authority? Don't be scared to talk to your doctor about it. The doctor, as of right now in this time period, he or she is not going to feel comfortable saying, "Oh yeah, go do some psychedelics." But they should know that you're planning on it so that they can help make sure that you do it safely, right? Like they're going to tell you if there's a risk with the medicine that you're taking for serotonin syndrome or any other kind of interaction. So don't be, don't ask your doctor, hey, should I? Because they're going to tell you no to protect their license. But if you say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this, what are the possible effects? They can guide you in the right direction. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and it is so important to base this also in some medical clearance as
Mm-hmm.
well, because, that would be the difference of what we do versus, you go to a weekend retreat someplace
Mm-hmm.
with someone that doesn't have extensive training
Mm-hmm.
or the medical knowledge that we do.
Mm-hmm.
There is a long list. In fact, clients are always shocked when I give them the packet, and it's about 10 pages long of
Mm-hmm.
all the medications you can't be taking within 10 days of taking a plant or animal medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Not the same with ketamine.
Right.
Ketamine's very unique in that it has less interactions. There still is a risk of serotonin syndrome. So it is important not only disclose medications you're taking, but also herbal supplements
Mm-hmm.
as well as just supplements in general, because those can interact. But ketamine, relatively speaking, has the least side effects
Mm-hmm.
and interactions with other medications, which is really nice because if someone comes into me and they're on an antidepressant and they're very depressed, I don't want to taper them off of a medication or
Mm-hmm.
have their psychiatrist taper them off a medication. I'm not doing the tapering, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to have their psychiatrist or their nurse practitioner taper them off that antidepressant. We can actually work with ketamine to get them more stable, to start to open up new pathways of thinking, create some neuroplasticity, and then they can work with their practitioner to slowly taper off these psychotropic meds.
Yeah, and it's really, really important. You mentioned medicines but there's also conditions, right? Like we want to know, right? Like one of the things that I think people are surprised at when they get that documentation, especially if like we're going to do a retreat in Mexico or we're going, to even see somebody for ketamine, like, hey, are you on a MAOI? Like, are you on heart medicine? Because these can interact. Serotonin in particular, which is one of the neurotransmitters that we know is elevated in this work, it affects your heart. It affects your digestion. Those neurotransmitters work in multiple places in the body, not just your brain. So we want to know these things. Like, do you have a heart condition? Do you have gastrointestinal problems? Like we need to know so that
Yeah,
we can keep you
absolutely.
safe. Yeah.
Absolutely. Also thyroid,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
what's someone's thyroid,
Mm-hmm.
because these medicines can disrupt thyroid. And so if you have not had stable thyroid numbers for at least 6 months, we really want to get you medically stable before we engage in this treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Is your diabetes under control?
Mm-hmm.
Have you recently been prescribed, blood pressure medication? These are all things that we want to make sure are in a controlled state for at least 6 months before we're engaging in any type of psychedelic work. As well as it's really important to understand, one of the things that we do that's very different is we're going to measure your blood pressure before we even start these medicines. If your blood pressure's up,
Not happening.
not happening. We're going to send you for a heart clearance. How many of these individuals that have gone to these weekend retreats remember getting their blood pressure checked
Mm-hmm.
before and after they've had these
Yeah.
medicines? It's not happening.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And I mean, I had a client who got really upset with me because she came in to do ketamine treatment and we checked her blood pressure and it was crazy high. Like it was 180 over like 98.
Ooh.
And it's like, oh, honey, no. We waited a few minutes, made sure that it wasn't just, white coat syndrome where she was nervous before coming in. And even after the third time checking her, changing arms, checking her blood pressure, it was still like 170 over 95. It's like, sorry, you have to go home. I can't. This is not safe for you. Obviously didn't charge her, but it's like we're not taking a risk with your health and your life. That's not happening. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is a really good part of that demystifying the
Mm-hmm.
psychedelics and really understanding that this is a medical treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, people go out and go to Burning Man, go to these weekend experiences and have an experience that can be very mystical, can be very awe-opening, connect them to some other level of consciousness. There can be rituals and ceremonies that are involved in that. But when you're actually working with a trained therapist,
Mm-hmm.
psychiatrist, nurse practitioner, we're actually going to make this a more medical based approach.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at that, again, it comes back to this piece of where, as a faith believing individual, do you kind of place psychedelics? Do
Mm-hmm.
you place it in this mystical ritual place, or can you see that there is actually this grounding in medicine?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 100%. Yeah. And I think it's hard because I think, for us as therapists, faith becomes part of the biopsychosocial environment where people do get healing. So we want people to include their faith-based orientation to their experience, but that's not the domain we are working in, right? Like we want to elevate that with people so that they can appreciate it and it's a resource for them as they're healing. But that's not our domain. Our domain is the psychological healing, the medical part of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we talk about the psychological part of that, if we kind of get into the neuroscience of
Mm-hmm.
what actually is happening,
Mm-hmm.
like things like, I'm a little bit dyslexic, so I always mix up the terms, but BDNF?
BDNF, yeah, good
Yeah.
job.
Mm-hmm.
Brain-derived neurotropic factor, exactly. That's a neurohormone that is secreted in almost every form of psychedelics and also in auto-induced cognitive trance. We think that that's also the mechanism that's going forward. But BDNF is necessary for your brain to heal. It's necessary for neurotransmitters to be able to be shared properly across the synaptic channels, and it's necessary for any inflammation to be lowered in the brain. So if you don't have enough BDNF, that inflammation is going to have a hard time coming down. So if you have any kind of neuroinflammation and you don't have enough BDNF, you're going to suffer. You're going to struggle. So yeah.
Which BDNF is so important. And I actually have a personal reason why
Yeah.
I've been very concerned about this. I had a daughter who had a neuroinflammation and she looked like she became schizophrenic.
Yeah.
It was a really scary situation. And if I had not got her to the right providers who knew that it was neuroinflammation and we needed to reduce that and work in increasing her BDNF, I'd have a daughter who would probably still be hospitalized at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we've been friends a long time. That was an incredibly scary situation. I remember that. And it's hard because I think that there's not enough, the medical establishment as we know it is really quick to dismiss addressing some of these aspects that they don't know about, and it's just because they don't know about them. It's not because they're not valid. It's like, well, I don't know how to do that, so I'm not going to do that. Right? And it's like, whoa, okay, find the right provider, then find the right doctor, find the right neurologist, find the right naturopath, somebody who can work with you on what's actually happening. And yeah, that's a really good point to just kind of bring back home to when you start talking about medicine and science, make sure that you are honoring your own voice as well. right? Like, and I mean, I remember this very well. You were you just championing everywhere you went and advocating like, no, you're looking at it wrong. No, you're looking at it wrong. I'm a therapist. This is not how this works. Like, look at this way. Oh, you're right. Oh, run this test. Oh yeah, look at that. Like that
Mhm.
was yeah, that
Yeah.
was a scary
Yeah,
situation.
which is interesting because how much is neuroinflammation actually a contributory part of why people are struggling with mental health,
Mm-hmm.
bipolar, depression,
Yeah.
anxiety, and if
Schizophrenia.
schizophrenia, and if we can increase BDNF. Now, it does become a little bit difficult place if we're dealing with someone who has active psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
We're certainly not going to step right into psychedelics. We want to work medically to start to reduce that neuroinflammation. There's some supplements, there's some, actual psychotropic medications
Mm-hmm.
that will reduce some of the neuroinflammations as well as some other medications. So that's why it's important if you do struggle with mental health concerns, especially if you've had a history of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, that you're really working from a medical standpoint. Don't
Mm-hmm.
read a research article about how psychedelics are changing people's lives
Mm-mm.
and think like, oh, let me go do
Yeah.
this. You really want to make sure you're working with, you know, proper medical guidance as you enter
Yeah.
in, and yes, amazing things can happen when we increase the BDNF.
Absolutely. And another, just to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, one of the things I want to make sure people don't take away from this is we are not advocating that people with active psychosis should reduce their BDNF or increase their BDNF by doing psychedelics. What we're saying is if you have some sort of condition that makes you prone to any kind of psychosis, you need to be especially careful with psychedelics and other substances that will maybe increase dopamine, like cannabis, and reduce the BDNF. So we want people to just be aware that there's so much going on at the brain level, right? And you want to be mindful that if you're having more, kind of psychotic or manic episodes when you do any substance, you want to think about it from a neurochemical perspective rather than just a consciousness perspective. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that this is the interesting place where research is really coming in and is really like, taking its stride, is looking at what is actually happening
mhm,
when people take these substances.
mhm,
How is that changing the structure of the brain? The default mode network, another
mhm.
important area.
Absolutely. There's so many active aspects of the default mode network. And when you take them offline or when you activate them, like if you have too much dopamine, that's going to actually activate the DMN as opposed to bring it down or take it offline for you. So, if you start to feel paranoid, your DMN is activated, right? Like
Hmm.
if you are worried about your ego structure, then your DMN is activated. If you are taking that off and you're starting to feel, oh no, I feel connected, feel more like I'm part of everything, then your DMN is probably going offline. Like that's one way to know that. If you're like, "Oh my god, what's happening? What's happening?" You're in your amygdala fight or flight. Like your DMN is it's on. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and the really great aspect of working with psychedelics and impacting the DMN is that we can actually help clients, watch clients go through this process of reducing rumination. So, if they're
Mhm.
really struggling with OCD,
Mhm.
they start to notice that their rumination, their patterns, their obsessions, their compulsions can start to decrease, and rigid thought patterns really start to shift.
Mhm.
So, this is another key important aspect, and so then we get that cognitive flexibility.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting. So a lot of the research points to when the DMN is offline, what's actually happening with psychedelics is your brain is able to make more connections across different areas of the brain. So when your DMN is activated, it's kind of keeping you in the same rigid channels that you're used to. So you're kind of focused on that rumination piece, like, oh, what about this? What about this? What about this? Um, Whereas when those come offline, when the DMN is not like controlling all of those network connections anymore, then your brain goes, oh, wait a minute, I've never been over here to this circuit. Let me see if I can connect to that circuit and see if there's anything there for me. Oh, look, I have associative memory here. I can make a connection. Oh, I didn't think about it that way. It gives you the options that you don't have when the DMN is directing all of that thought. So, yeah, that's,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Fascinating research. Like I recommend anybody who wants to look more at this. Like there's huge amount of research by Robin Carhart Harris, who is up at University of California, San Francisco. He's probably the leading thinker in this area, and his work is really responsible for us understanding how psychedelics play a role. And the DMN discovery stuff came about, probably 20 years ago through, was it Washington University up
I believe so.
in St. Louis?
Hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, tons of great research to go find and really see how we make sense of this.
Yeah, yeah, it's so fascinating. And I think we're really in a time and place where we're mapping out what's happening in the mind through
Yeah.
functional MRI
Mhm.
scans, and just doing this deeper dive in the research. And I think it's fascinating work, as well as some of the fascinating work that we've seen, even looking at how psychotropic drugs maybe are actually the placebo effect.
Mm, indeed, and I think one of the things that we're gonna have to well, I would say one of the things important to me personally, and I think can be an important way of looking at what we are doing as therapists and what the scientific community is doing in terms of neurosciences, we don't know much, you know, with because the brain, we can't do research on human beings the way we do research on animals, which I don't know that we should do them on animals either, but the way that we can think about research is we just don't have access, and it's good that we don't, right? Like ethically, we should not be doing research on humans in a way that would hurt them. But because of that, we just don't know a lot. We have to rely on what we can do with modeling, and what we can look at when people are sick, or when people agree to look at their brains after they've passed. Like there's a limit on what we can know based on the ethics of research, and that's a good limit. But it does mean that we're limited, and we don't know a lot about what the actual mechanisms are. We have some ideas, and we have some good models. We don't know everything. And I mean, if you just talk to any medical doctor, talk to any neuroscientist, talk to any psychiatrist, they'll tell you, yeah, what we know is like teeny tiny compared to what there is to know. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so this again, it becomes part of that discernment part.
Hmm.
Who am I going to? What information am I looking at? This isn't something that you jump into this weekend.
Right.
Take your time, get to really understand some of the science behind this. Talk to individuals, talk to your medical providers, you know, talk with a therapist who's been doing this work for a
Yeah.
while.
And I would also offer too, I think that there are some like areas of psychotherapy and psychology that are more prone to be open than others. Like if your therapist or your psychiatrist is kind of a behaviorist, CBT oriented person, they're probably not going to be really open-minded about psychedelics. Um, Even the science of it, they may not be very open to it, right? So when you talk to your therapist, if it's something that you're curious about, just ask them what their orientation is. Like, have they ever had a psychedelic experience, or did they just do, that one time one in college when they were in their 20s?
Hmm.
But if they've read any articles about it, have they done any research themselves? And, rather than just go to somebody and say, "Hey, I want to do this," ask them what they know. Ask them how educated they are in it if you're already seeing someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're seeing someone who went through school probably, 10 years or more ago,
Mhm.
from about the mid 70s through
Mhm. Mhm.
probably, even up
Early
to five
2000s,
early
yeah.
2000s. What were we taught? We were taught
Mhm.
psychedelics were bad. People
Yeah,
jumped off of roofs,
right,
you know? So, and I know for me, that was a big hurdle I had to get beyond because what I learned in school was bad.
right.
Now, they didn't really go into why it was bad, other than it was just bad. They criminalized it, during the war on drugs, and that was it.
Mhm.
And so sometimes, I think here's the problem is we go to school, we get that master's degree or that PhD, and we're
Mhm.
like, I learned it, you
Right, I
know,
know it.
I know it.
Yeah.
I know it. And we don't kind of look beyond. We don't continue
Mm.
that education, even though we're required,
Yeah.
part of our licensing to have continuing education. A lot of
Mhm.
providers just go to the bare minimum.
Yeah.
They really aren't looking at new areas of development within the field of psychology.
Yeah, and with all due respect to our colleagues who are psychiatrists, I think that they sometimes are even more rigid. They have, because psychiatrists tend to be the black sheep of the medical profession anyway, and then they just want to hold on to that, surety of their experience. So, I mean, it's obviously not true for everyone. We have a lot of psychiatrists that we work with who are wonderful, but I think there are some who, are not as open minded as maybe require for this area of thought.
Absolutely. And you might be surprised, they might be very
Yeah.
open-minded. I don't know how many individuals that I interview
Mhm.
for a retreat or even for ketamine
Mhm.
therapy that haven't even discussed it with their current provider because they're fearful
Mhm.
of judgment or, being told that, what they're thinking is just, outside the
Right.
limits. And also, look, there is this gray area too. Like here, currently in California, the only decriminalized option is ketamine.
Ketamine. Mhm.
So, it is a little bit of a tricky space because if you go and talk to your provider, they may not really be able to engage in a conversation if you're looking
Yeah.
at going out of country to go to a retreat so you can access some of these other medicines.
Yeah, totally fair. And look, the bottom line is the medical a medical provider for me, a medical provider who is trying to protect their clients is also going to protect their license. So they're going to tell you like I can't give you a recommendation, yay or nay on this, but I can tell you maybe the medicine behind it, right? Like the science behind it. If your serotonin goes up too high or goes down too low, you're going to have effects like you and that's the data you're looking for, that kind of information. What effect is gonna have on this medicine or that medicine, or what do I need to know? And if they don't know, hopefully they'll refer you to somebody who does. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think this is where that collision between faith and science becomes a little bit muddy
Mhm.
because if someone is a person of faith and they want to have a discussion, they want that medical authority, it can be really tricky to navigate and get that information,
Mhm.
even though there's tons of research. There's a lot of a medical authority out there. So I think that that becomes a little bit challenging when we're
Mhm.
trying to intersect this space of like seek medical authority.
Mhm.
There is medical authority, there is research behind this. Um, and, at what point do I listen to the medical authority? But where are the lines within that medical authority?
Mm. That is a really good question because I think we're trained, certainly in the West and in the US, like we look for authority. We look for people outside of us to kind of bless what we do and tell us it's okay, right? Like that's kind of a hallmark of American culture. I think well, Western culture generally, I think we're looking for authority all the time. And we're not used to having our own authority in that regard. So we need the blessing of doctors and therapists. And the church has told us that for a long time, like to look to the authority of the Bible, to look to the authority of priests, to look to the authority of whoever's got more knowledge than us, right? Like that's kind of has gone with the territory for over 2000 years, right?
Hmm.
Like that's kind of the where the church started was owning the authority, right?
Yeah,
Back in the
absolutely.
day.
Absolutely. And the Bible talks about how God's given gifts to individuals.
Mhm.
He's given the gift of teacher, he's given the gift of physician, counselor, healer, and so we know that there is, authority granted to others.
Mm.
You know, it's just, again, there becomes this interesting place of when, there becomes these guardrails that have now been put up in place that were put in during the war on drugs and then the emerging research
Mhm.
and doctors who are fearful of, if I talk about this, am I jeopardizing my license? Look, it's the reason why I don't serve psilocybin or
Mm.
ayahuasca here in the United States. And people are like, you're traveling all the way to Mexico to do that? Well, yeah, because, I'm concerned about my license and I don't
Mhm.
want to risk my license. And we're having starting to see the decriminalization like we talked about
Mhm.
before, so I can go maybe now to Oregon and serve psilocybin, but accessing some of these other medicines like bufo, the toad olivirus, or combo, the Amazonian frog, or ayahuasca, those are things that are not decriminalized
Yeah.
here. So there is this delicate place too. And then there becomes the delicate place of like, where do I feel like God's given me? Has he
Mm.
given me a gift of, you know, a healer, and that's an interesting place to be and to walk in that space. I don't think I have any divine, amazing, supernatural, kind of authority there. But I do feel like I have good discernment in a lot of areas, and, wisdom in counseling. So I'm able to bridge some of that authority in what I'm doing.
I think that's a really important thing, like to talk about from the perspective of if you feel like you have a divine gift, right? Like, is the gift, is whatever gift you're given, it could be to be a writer, it could be to be a healer, to be whatever. Like, how do you as a therapist, how do you walk in that and straddle the line? Like, where do you bring in discernment, and how do you communicate that to your clients?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question, one that I'm still kind of grappling with, and
Mhm.
probably more so I've been grappling with it after learning some clients were a little bit hesitant since I
Mm.
started doing this work of, am I walking outside of lines that I shouldn't be walking outside of? And it's an interesting place where other clients have said, they've sat with me and they feel like, oh, wow, I feel like, this has been a very different therapy experience. I feel like the wisdom that you've offered me, the questions that you've asked, or even just being in your presence, I feel like there is something that's different here. And again, there's not, I think it's a really hard place to be. I don't want to,
Mhm.
claim that I'm like some healer, um, you know, but at the same time, I'm watching clients go through a shift and a change. And so, I think it's really hard because I think there's this part of me that's wants to be humble,
Mhm.
and not, proclaim that I have any special gifting.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think that's a fair thing. I think we're taught, that humility is required to do any of this work, right? Like, and I'm not necessarily just talking about spiritually. Like, we have to walk in humility as therapists just generally, because we can never know what is actually happening inside of our client. We can only look at their behavior or look at the questions that they ask and try to do our best to be a good guide. But, so humility is kind of, I hope, baked in. But at the same time, you have worked on, we both have invested time, invested our energy. And there is this kind of element of, for me anyway, like, what you are seeking is seeking you. There's this idea that however you think of God, the universe, divinity, it's not one-sided. It's a relationship. So if you're in a relationship with whatever you call God, then it's okay. It's also okay to claim, "Hey, no, I've invested here. I don't claim to have all the answers, but if I feel like I'm being called and I'm answering the call, then what harm is there in saying that?" Right?
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah, so I think it comes back again to intention and
mm,
why have I stepped into this lane? And my intention is to help people on a pathway of alleviating suffering,
mm,
to help guide them in a direction that, can promote healing,
mm,
and alleviate suffering. And, look, again, we can't move past beyond, we're in this mental health crisis, you
mm,
know and if, the working with these medicines can help with rewiring those negative thought patterns, processing trauma in a new way, and have this long-term lasting benefit, um you know I would be remiss, I think, not to take hold of a pathway that would actually provide an opportunity for healing. And that's the intention behind
mm,
moving in this space, not to become the next great shaman.
yeah.
I will never be that,
Mhm.
but to really be, a teacher, a counselor, and to sit along with someone to provide them a pathway to healing.
I mean, it comes back to as well, like, even no matter what faith you follow, I think every faith wants people to develop their own discernment, right? And their own, I mean, it's hard because for me, I would say authority and sovereignty based on my work, right? Like, those are the things that are important to me, that all people deserve to have that. That doesn't mean that you don't believe in something, or that you don't believe in God, or that you can't believe in God, but just that if you believe that you're here for a reason, or you believe that there's a relationship to be had with that aspect of divinity, then maybe it's okay to claim your own authority in it too. And that, again, we're back to discernment. Everything seems to come back there. Um
Yeah,
but
and when
yeah.
we talk about intention, the verse that came to me
Mhm.
when I was really grappling with this, where does this line up with my faith?
Mhm.
You know, 1 Samuel 16:7 states, the Lord does not look at things like people look at.
Mm.
People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.
Mhm.
And I think that this really highlights how God prioritizes the condition and the intent of the heart when he assesses our actions. And again, my heart here is guided by this principle of working with the substance that God created.
Mhm.
He gave us these plants, He gave us the knowledge, He gifted us with talents. And I'm working with that with the pure heart of alleviating human suffering. And yes, absolutely, individuals can find many pathways to that. Prayer may be a pathway for that,
Mhm.
meditation, seeing your religious leader,
Mhm.
you know, working with your religious group, can also provide that mental health healing. And
Mm.
again, there's where discernment comes in.
Right.
What's the pathway that's been laid out before me?
Mhm.
And is that pathway to go this way, or is that to work with maybe a therapist that's specialized in this other area?
Yeah. Totally fair. So, I mean, would you wanna say anything to the people who would, have already maybe criticized you for that work, or is there anything to say to them?
I think we all have a different path, and
Mhm.
that's okay. If you make a choice that maybe working with me doesn't line up with your pathway, I just hope that you would maybe sit down and have a conversation with me and have an opportunity to talk to me and really understand my heart rather than make a judgment. And I think there's the interesting place. While we say that we are to, as faith believing individuals, have love for one another,
Mm.
and not to cast judgment, how often we do run to judgment,
Oh,
which is so opposite from really
yeah.
what God's word teaches us.
That's so interesting because, yeah, it's judgment. Judgment winds up taking the place of discernment.
Mm-hmm.
That's dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
actually. Yeah, because, you know, he who he who has not sinned, he let you cast the first stone, right? Like that's yeah, that's a hard one to get people to kind of take on. People are
Mm-hmm.
really quick to judge.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. So, as we're kind of like engaging in this conversation, is there
Mhm.
anything else that starts to come to the surface for you if you were to sit with someone who was grappling with how does this line up with my faith belief system,
Mhm.
or an absence of a faith?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, for me, it's, I think if somebody's looking for healing, I want to understand what are the things to them that are missing in their life that might help with the healing process, right? Is it that they don't have a community? Is it they don't have good relationships? Is it they have some trauma that they're trying to struggle through and make sense of? And in understanding that, I want to kind of help bridge the gap for that as the therapist, right? In terms of how we bring psychedelics into that, for me, the psychedelics are going to help kind of bring out of the unconscious or bring in their relationship to themselves. It's going to bring forth the things that are, or it has the opportunity to bring forth, I should say, the symbols of the things that maybe will help guide them. One of the things that at first when we were at I had, some issue with this language that they use, the inner healing intelligence. It really kind of irritated me. But it's true. Like I don't have a better name for it, right? Like Jung called it the self. Some people might want to call it God. Like however you want to think of it. Um, I think that everybody needs to have a belief in that. Like if you cut your finger, your body knows how to heal the finger. You're not sitting there going, "Okay, I need to knit the skin back together and I got to figure out how to make those capillaries kind of reconnect." Like that, we don't do that. That's not a conscious part of our awareness. And we have the same thing with psychological and emotional healing. So I think that if you trust that your psyche is going to have a map to know what you need to heal, and it can communicate with you, and when it does so, it will do so in symbols. So that for me is kind of the issue. Like, okay, from a faith-based perspective or from a non-faith perspective, your psyche is going to bring forth the symbols that you need to have that healing work. And when you're doing psychedelics, it's almost all symbolic communication. It is not going to be the kind of communication that is direct and literal. I mean, sometimes it is, but that's rare, right? Like we're so used to seeing like, oh, I saw this thing and I felt this thing and I remembered I had this memory and I this song showed up. Like, yeah, that's your psyche giving you the symbolic communication of what you need as resources to find that healing. Even, the work that I'm doing in France, the auto-induced cognitive trance, like we talk about resources all the time, the things that show up, it could be a gesture. And it might be something like you're doing this and you're just like, I have no idea why I'm doing that. Do you feel better doing it? Yeah, I do. Okay, well then do that. It doesn't matter if it has a meaning or not. It matter. I mean, you're not going to go hurt someone, but the thing doesn't have to have a clear conscious meaning for it to be healing and productive. And I think that's the thing I would want people to understand, that from a faith perspective, the symbols that are going to show up are probably going to be really rooted in your faith. And that's okay. Like let it show up. And if you don't have a faith, they're going to be rooted in something else that's meaningful to you.
Absolutely. Well, and then this becomes the piece of integration,
Ah,
right?
yes, absolutely.
Afterwards, is the meaning, what came up for you?
Hmm.
How do we integrate that? Do we integrate that with our faith? Do we integrate that more scientifically? Do we integrate that just more by our own discernment and,
Hmm.
and talking with others? You know, it becomes a very important aspect of the whole process of working with these medicines is we can't forgo that integration part.
100%. And it's interesting because I have had clients who have either done psychedelic journeys with me or they've done psychedelic journeys on their own. And we will talk about some of the material that came up for years. And it means that that integration is still incomplete at that point, or it has a new meaning to address a new area that's opened up for that client. Because integration really is the point of doing psychedelic medicine, period, right? Like if you're not looking for integration, then why are you doing it? You're just getting on a merry-go-round and taking a ride, right? It's a roller coaster ride at that point. So
Right. Well, I'm still trying to figure out what that giant gummy bear means and how to integrate that because, it's still a little bit puzzling to
yeah,
me.
I get that. I get
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But you know what? It could be, I mean, it could be anything, right? It could be that you were in for a tasty treat as you were starting to open up a whole new area of your practice. Like, who knows? It could be anything.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know. But
But
yeah.
I mean, the creativity certainly has continued to come, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have continued to be creative and open. I mean, we developed this psychedelic practice. You have gone on to do all this other research and doing all this work in the working with all the different plant medicines and animal medicines and going to Mexico. And yeah, so I mean, it's been a doorway to creativity. Maybe that's partly what it meant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe live large. Go
Live
large.
live large and sweet.
And sweet,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Maybe maybe there we go.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the integrated piece. Live large and be sweet.
And or maybe bring the sweetness.
Bring the
Yeah,
sweetness.
let the sweetness be
Yeah,
part of your life.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Well, and the creativity piece. And,
Mhm.
I think that that's the other interesting avenue here. And there becomes a little bit more of the challenge when I do sit with someone who wants to engage in doing this work and maybe they don't have as much profound depression, anxiety,
Mhm.
or trauma. It's low lying. And I really kind of have looked at this as a medical treatment, but they're feeling a little stuck in life.
Mhm.
Where is that line too of how do we select clients to do
Mm.
this work?
That's a good question. I mean, I've been very surprised myself. Like I really thought when we started that it would be people who were kind of self-selected toward creativity. I thought that those would be the people that would get the most out of it. And actually, for me, the people who've gotten the most out of it have been the people I wouldn't have expected, right? The people who have had the biggest outcomes or the biggest shift in outcomes for me have been people who, this was their last resort or it was something that they didn't know what else to do and they were kind of rigid people. Like they were very logical, very kind of, in French we say Cartesian, right? Like they're very kind of like square. They think about everything in a very logical way. Those are the people who I would have been the most surprised by, that they do psychedelic medicine or they do other kinds of more psychodynamic or work on the unconscious, and they wind up with the biggest outcomes, the best outcomes. So, I personally thought that it was going to be this, oh, it's going to be the artists and the directors and the writers that are going to be really drawn to this. And yeah, those folks come, but the people who have the biggest outcomes have been surprisingly to me like the really kind of more kind of square thinkers, the
Hmm.
people who are thinking very logically all the most of the time
Hmm.
have the biggest change with working on the unconscious level.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think there is that mental health
Mhm.
benefit here, as well as, creativity can be a benefit as well. But, really, again, trying to place this more in the medical research
Mhm.
science place of just the alleviation of human suffering
Mhm.
that comes. And if we get this extra benefit of creativity, that's great, but that's not the primary reason we engaged in doing this work.
Yeah, but I think to your point, I would take it a little further and say actually creativity is a necessity because it's part of neuroplasticity.
Mm,
So if you have somebody who's very, kind of stuck and they're ruminating all the time, part of that is a lack of neuroplasticity, that creativity is part of making someone more neuroplastic. So I actually would take it further as opposed to just kind of keeping
mhm.
it on that. I think neuroplasticity and creativity are requirements for mental health.
Wow, that's an interesting argument. One I hadn't considered before. Actually, you're right. Because if we look at, someone who's got depression or anxiety, they become rigid in their thinking
Hmm.
in a lot of ways. There isn't creative thought. There isn't, thinking outside of like myself, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, and they get stuck. They get
Mm-hmm.
like, well, I can't do it that way. I can't do this. I can't do that. I can't.
Mm-hmm.
I only have this really narrow channel that I can operate in. And when we start to open that up a little bit, then there's more opportunity for healing.
Absolutely. Which that probably helps with motivation.
Hmm.
That might help with actually enjoying life again.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, getting past that kind of anhedonia that people suffer from when they're really really depressed, like giving them another channel, giving them another opportunity. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that, we've kind of posed that question if medical evidence supports this,
Hmm.
why wouldn't we consider it?
Hmm.
And, again, in that line of where faith intersects science, medical evidence that really supports this. So, what would be the remaining hesitations for individuals? I think it's just being able to take a step forward and have a conversation with a provider.
Absolutely. And don't be scared of what you're going to find, right? Like I think people who don't know enough about psychedelics are afraid of the bad trip, right? Like they're afraid of having an encounter with something um that they're not prepared for. And what I would say is, it's interesting. I follow Robin Carhart Harris on social media, and just this morning he had shared something he's reading and outlined that what's really happening when you have any kind of negative experience, whether we're talking about bad trip or bad memory or just a yucky day, all of that negativity is coming from inside of you. It's not coming from outside. Like the world, yes, the world is hard and harsh, and there are scary things in the world, but what's really happening when we're living in fear is we're projecting our own fear out into the world. And so when that negativity is showing up, the first question that we should ask is, what am I afraid of on the inside that I'm trying to bring out into the outside world? And if you can do that, then you can heal, right? But if you just keep it on the inside all the time, you can never heal because it just is going to eat you away from the inside.
Absolutely. Well, and maybe it is fear that stops from even having this dialogue
Oh,
and
yeah.
even entering into this conversation. I mean, my own experience, I was really fearful that I was going to blurt something out loud, that maybe I had some dark skeleton in there that I,
That you
had
didn't even
hidden
know about.
away that I didn't even know about, and it was going to come out, and what was I going to say that was going to, like, discredit myself in
Mhm.
some way that I was, a pious individual. I don't know. But I think there's, fear a lot of times stops us,
Yeah.
and maybe it is fear, and so we use judgment and fear to stop us from even
Mhm.
engaging in this conversation. And so again, I think there needs to be a call for having an open dialogue,
Mhm.
to gather in the streets, to gather
Mm.
with community and have a dialogue about this. Where does this fit with my faith? You know, how does science come in? What's that intersection? What's the cultural evolution looking like at
Yeah.
this time and space?
And how do I trust myself? You know?
Mm,
How do I trust myself? Like, no, I know what I need. I don't need it to always come from the outside. How do I learn again, we're back to discernment. How do I trust myself? How do I discern when I know versus when I don't know? Because sometimes we don't even know when we don't know. The unknown unknown, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Which then, if we go to discernment too, there is a piece. What does a faith believing person, you know, rely on?
Mhm.
Prayer, meditation. So
Mhm.
if this is something you're exploring, put it to prayer, put it to meditation.
Mhm.
The very thing that I did, I
Yeah.
sought out,
Ask somebody else.
prophetic
Yeah.
prayer.
Mhm.
I went to the prophetic prayer house and I had individuals pray with me
Mhm.
about this and pray over me, you know, and I spent a lot of time in my own meditation prayer,
Mhm.
in addition to looking at the
Yeah.
research. So I really did try to balance this, carefully between my faith and medical science and research and talking with individuals
Mhm.
and seeking guidance from religious authority.
Yeah. I mean, and just, to kind of wrap up for me, like that's, you and I don't have the same faith. So I wouldn't have chosen that particular method, but I would have chosen another method, right? Like I would have chosen maybe, having a meditation session or having a trance session or maybe talking to somebody in my faith to say, like, hey, I want to do this, but I'm not really sure. Like what questions should I ask, right? I might ask somebody to help me with the questions. Um, but yeah, I think everybody has anyone who has reservations based on their faith should seek out the answers in their faith. Like, go and use the same thing that's bringing the questions up. Use it to help answer the questions. Don't just presume that you have to go outside of your comfort zone to get the questions answered. But also learn to trust yourself. If the answers don't feel right, if the answers feel like they're cutting something off or they're dismissing your experience, then those aren't the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, I think this takes us to James 5:14, which instructs believers when they're seeking healing to, if anyone among you is sick, let them call the elders of the church to pray over them, anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. So, yes, go to your religious authorities, and in that, maybe also have a discussion of, how do I discern if I'm going to seek medical intervention, if I'm going to seek medical guidance in this, how do I discern the person to go to? Because so the Bible says, hey, when you are sick, go to the doctor.
Right. Yeah. Go get some help.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ask for help. And that
Mm-hmm.
that comes back to the community piece again, right? Like don't be afraid to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think this has been such an interesting conversation. I'm sure it will continue to evolve,
Mhm.
and if you have specific questions or comments, or maybe you disagree with the approach that we're taking today, I encourage you to look in the description, send us an email, contact us on our website, reach out to us. We'd love to sit down and talk with you a little bit more. If you've got information that you feel like we didn't present here, don't hesitate. We've got lots more podcasts to come. We can address some of those more controversial aspects that maybe we haven't touched on.
And we're not afraid of the scary stuff.
We're not afraid of the scary stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Bring it.
Bring it.
All right. All right.
All right. Well, tune in for us next time. We're going to dive in a little bit more to what is integration? What
Mhm.
does that look like? How do I take an experience and integrate that? And, if maybe I had a bad trip, what do I do then? So we look
Okay.
forward to tuning in to the next time we see you.